All right, let's get right into it. We're going to tackle a huge question today, one that's at the very core of how we govern ourselves. In a democracy, what does a government actually owe its people?
And that's really the big question, isn't it? It seems so simple on the surface, but trust me, the answer is, well, it's anything but. This one question affects literally everything: how we vote, how our leaders act, especially when things get tough.
Okay, so before we can even begin to answer that, we have to pin down this one super important phrase: the will of the people. I mean, what does that even mean?
This is the basic deal of democracy, right? The whole idea is that power flows from the bottom up, from us, the people, to the government. They're supposed to be our agents, carrying out what we collectively want. It sounds great, it's a really powerful idea.
But, as this cartoon perfectly illustrates, for the folks actually in power, that whole will of the people thing can get complicated. The real problem isn't the idea, it's the practice. How on earth do you take the messy, sometimes totally contradictory wants and needs of millions of people and turn that into actual coherent policy? It's a huge challenge.
So if the government is supposed to listen, how does it do it? Like, what are the actual tools, the nuts and bolts of democracy, that are supposed to figure out what we all want?
Well, it basically boils down to two main ways of doing things. First, you've got direct democracy. That's where citizens, people like you and me, vote on every single issue directly. Then there's representative democracy, which is what we have here in Canada and what most countries use. We don't vote on the laws ourselves. Instead, we elect people to go and make those big decisions for us.
Now, in Canada, our system is called first past the post. And honestly, this horse race analogy is spot on. Think about it. In every single voting district, what we call a riding, the candidate who gets the most votes, even if it's just one more vote than the next person, wins the whole thing. The winner takes it all, period. Okay, and this is where you can really see how that plays out. Check out this real-world example from an election back in 2008. The Conservative candidate won the seat with 49% of the vote. But wait a minute, do the math. That means 51%, the majority of voters in that area, chose someone else. But their votes, they didn't translate into any representation at all. It's a really key feature, or maybe a flaw depending on how you look at it, of our system.
So let's zoom out now. We're going to go from that one single riding to the entire country for that very same election. And what you're looking at here is the popular vote. This is the raw number, the actual percentage of Canadians who voted for each party.
And this is what that vote translated into in terms of actual power in Parliament. See the difference? It's huge. The Conservatives got 38% of the popular vote, but that gave them 46% of the seats, more than enough to run the country. But then look at the Green Party. Almost 7% of the country voted for them, and they got 0 seats, absolutely none. So you have to ask, right? Is a system that produces a result like this really reflecting the will of the people? Of course, democracy is more than just marking an X on a ballot every few years. In between elections, we have all these other ways to make our voices heard. You can have referendums on big national questions, people can form interest groups to lobby politicians directly, or hey, you can just take it to the streets and protest.
But here's the real test. What happens when the people make their will known, loud and clear, and the government just says, no? That's when things can get really tense. That's when you see some of the biggest crises in a democracy's history.
A textbook Canadian example of this is the conscription crisis back in World War I. The government in Ottawa was convinced that mandatory military service, a draft, was absolutely necessary to win the war. But in Quebec, the opposition was massive, just overwhelming. The government went ahead and did it anyway, and the result was chaos, deadly riots, and a political wound that, honestly, you could argue, has never fully healed.
Fast forward a few decades, and it happens again, in a totally different way. We're in 1970 during the October crisis. Terrorists from the FLQ kidnap a politician and a diplomat. The federal government's response? They invoke something called the War Measures Act. And just like that, civil liberties are suspended, and you have the army on the streets of Canadian cities.
Now, a lot of people, including a guy who would later become Quebec's premier, René Lévesque, saw this as a huge panicked overreaction. Under this act, the police arrested more than 450 people without even laying charges. And here's the kicker. Most of them weren't terrorists. They were poets, singers, union leaders, people whose only crime was being critical of the government. But the government, led by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, stood their ground. They argued that this drastic step was necessary to stop a violent few from destroying the entire democratic system. And this right here, is the ultimate dilemma, isn't it? Does a government sometimes have to go against the rights and wishes of some people in order to protect the democratic freedoms of everyone else?
And this kind of conflict doesn't always involve riots or the army. Let's look at something more recent, from around the time of the Iraq War. There were American soldiers who refused to fight, and they came to Canada seeking refuge. And if you looked at a poll from 2008, it was clear what Canadians wanted. 64%, a solid majority, said we should let them stay.
And it wasn't just a quiet opinion. People were vocal about it, holding protests. Parliament even passed a motion saying, let them stay. But it was non-binding. And at the end of the day, the government in power just disagreed, and they deported them. It's a pretty stark example of a government hearing the will of the people and just choosing to go the other way.
This constant back and forth, this tension between the people and the government, you could actually argue that's a sign of a healthy democracy. And to really get why, it helps to look at the alternative. Let's talk about authoritarian systems, where the whole power dynamic is completely flipped on its head.
And here's the key difference, right here on the screen. In an authoritarian system, power flows one way, from the top down. The leaders decide, and the people obey. That's it. But in a democracy, at least in theory, it's the opposite. Power is supposed to come from us, from the bottom up. We're the ones who give the government its right to rule.
So in a system like that, when people disagree with the government, well, that's not seen as exercising a democratic right. It's seen as a threat. And threats aren't debated, they're crushed. In that kind of government, the whole concept of the will of the people is just completely irrelevant.
And that brings us right back where we started, to our own messy, complicated, sometimes frustrating democracy. And what all this shows is that it's not some kind of perfect machine that just runs by itself. It's a balancing act, a really difficult one, and it needs everyone to participate, both the government and us, the citizens. Because, think about it, for the will of the people to mean anything, the people actually have to show up and express it. But here in Canada, voter turnout is often pretty low, sometimes just barely over 60%. So this cartoon, it's asking a really tough question. If almost 40% of the people aren't even voting, how can we possibly know what their will is? And if we don't know, what does that do to the government's responsibility to listen?
So that leaves us with one last and pretty provocative idea to chew on. If democracy is built on the will of the people, but a huge chunk of the population stays silent, do we need to rethink how we vote? Should voting be more than just a right that you can take or leave? Should it be a mandatory duty, a responsibility that comes with being a citizen?